I'm customizing miniature kits to make semi-handmade dollhouse miniatures. Up first, I'm assembling this miniature canned food kit with some custom details. The cans are solid aluminum, so they look more realistic and can be stacked easily. I'll be adding paint to these, so I'm cleaning them off with some rubbing alcohol just in case there's any grease. The top of each can has these realistic can ridges. To make them look dented, I'm using my metal file around the edges. Now that it's no longer a perfect circle, I'm using some pliers to add some dents. This particular kit has vintage labels, so I'm adding a lot of aging to my cans. I'm finishing by filing the sharp edges. I picked up small tubes of super glue recently, so they won't harden in the tube before I have time to use them. I capped the nozzle with some baking soda to further protect the glue from hardening. You'll have to take my word for it, but I'm adding a small bit of super glue around the edges of the can where rust would most likely form. I'm dipping the liquid super glue into some baking soda to create a texture and immediately harden the glue. I varied the amount of texture for each can, so I'll have a nice variety of rust. For some, I added a bit of rust along the lower lip as well. To cap my super glue until next time, I squeeze a tiny bit of glue at the end of the nozzle and dip it into baking soda. This cap is easy to pop off and ensures the glue won't go to waste. I'm making a paint mixture of black, brown, and matte Mod Podge. This paint concoction will get stuck in the super glue texture I created and stick to the metal can because of the Mod Podge. I'm adding a messy coat of paint to the top and bottom of each can, allowing the paint to dry. This can doesn't have any rust texture, but the paint will still emphasize the ridges and the dents I created. Since the paint has already dried, I added a bit of water to a paper towel to dab and scrub off some of the paint. I used this technique in my miniature lab in a book to create a grimy sink and add some grunge to the cabinets. I'm wiping away any paint that's stuck to the body of the can so the label can stick more easily. The aluminum is still pretty bright and shiny, so I'm adding a layer of burnt sienna and Mod Podge to create my first layer of faux rust. You can play around with removing this layer while it's still wet or rubbing it away once it's dried. The burnt sienna paint subdues the aluminum and adds a layer of warmth. You can see the difference when you compare them to these cans I haven't added the burnt sienna to yet. For an entirely different look, you could use a layer of this burnt sienna mixture followed by some glued on cinnamon. The cinnamon would nicely mimic the texture of the baking soda without the super glue smell. Use what you have and experiment with a few different techniques. You might learn something, and the variety makes the miniatures more interesting and realistic. The 10 labels are different and include strawberries, apples, cherries, peaches, tomato, carrots, pears, peas, pumpkin, and corn. The labels are vibrantly colored and shiny, so I'm aging them with a mixture of ultra matte clear and some brown paint. I started out by dabbing on the paint, but then started brushing it. This mixture applied to paper dried immediately, so if you don't want a streaky look, I suggest dabbing the paint or adding it, and while it's still wet, dabbing the excess away with a paper towel. I left 2 of the labels unpainted for comparison's sake. These labels are designed to be the exact height of the can, so I cut tightly to the graphic. I used white glue to attach my paper labels and remembered that the ridges are the top of the can, so none of my labels would be upside down. If your label is nice and upright, the ridges will be above the man's head. Something interesting, the labels barely wrap around the can, so don't cut your labels short. To further age the can, I used a pin to remove some of the label, then wisely switched to a metal ruler to avoid stabbing myself. The torn edges of the label are bright white and the can is shiny beneath, so I'm adding a layer of brown paint mixed with Mod Podge. You could also do the super glue trick or glue on some cinnamon for rust. I'm using Dirty Down Rust and Rust-All to create the look of rust. Up first is Dirty Down Rust, which is the best product I've found so far for creating realistic rust. It costs $30 for a small bottle, but creates extremely convincing looking rust and lasts forever. I've had my little bottle for about 2.5 years and have plenty left. It's water soluble, so you can actually use a damp paper towel to remove some of the rust effect if you'd like to customize it or if you applied it too heavily. I concentrated my rust around the edges of my black super glue globs. You can see the difference the rust effects makes on this can that doesn't have any super glue texture. The rust doll costs $10 for a much bigger bottle, but is quite watery and doesn't make nearly as good of a rust effect. There were no instructions included, so I'm not entirely sure I'm using this properly, but I did realize you need to add a couple layers to deepen the color and make it look more realistic. The can on the right was assembled with no modifications. In retrospect, I do like the high contrast of the unpainted label, so if I was doing this again, I would have used less brown paint. I don't have a project in mind for these cans, but I imagine you'd find them in an old fallout shelter or an abandoned general store. Today I'm making some chairs and modifying an existing stool for my Gryffindor Common Room. I'm taking a semi-handmade approach and starting with this House of Miniatures kit. This kit comes with enough pieces to make 2 chairs. The side pieces are too square for my liking, so I'm using some sandpaper to round the edges. I had to learn the hard way, but you should support skinny pieces like this when you're sanding so you don't snap them off. Sandpaper or an emery board works just fine if that's all you have, but I'd like to make it go a little bit faster by using a cheap metal file I got from Harbor Freight. A lot of viewers comment on how patient I am, but I'm actually impatient and I don't like tedious tasks, so I like to make little things like this go faster by using the right tool. When comparing the 2 pieces, you can see how sanding the edges makes the side of the chair look more realistic and in scale. The top of the chair is squared off and it's not part of the instructions, but I'm rounding the top as well. This chair is supposed to be assembled like this with these 2 pieces on the back, but I'm modifying the chair. Instead, I'm using the thinner piece at the top and this larger piece at the bottom, and I'll be adding spindles in between the 2 pieces. I was initially planning to use fancy toothpicks as my spindles, but I found these tiny turnings I got at Earth and Tree Miniatures. Since I'll be using these chairs in my Gryffindor Common Room project, I'd like a look that's more elevated and looks more antique. Of course, if you don't have these, you can go ahead and use toothpicks. I'd like the spindles to be more securely attached, so I made a hole starting with a smaller bit and then using a larger bit to prevent splitting the wood. I'm holding the top rail of the chair side by side with the bottom piece to try to get the holes to align so the spindle in the middle won't be crooked. Adding holes like this only took a couple of minutes, but it'll make the spindles a lot more secure than it would if I just glued them to the surface in between the rails. If they're just glued in, they could easily pop out at some point. I'll be adding 3 spindles, so I added 3 holes to each of the rail pieces. Now that the holes are added, I'm carefully sanding the edges, making sure I don't sand in too far, but also taking away the harsh edges. To trim my tiny turnings, I rolled them back and forth underneath my X-Acto knife and then snapped it. I dry fit the pieces together to make sure they work, but first I have to stain these before I assemble the chair. When I'm painting or staining tiny pieces, I like to stick them to a piece of tape to corral them. I'm using some watered down Waverly Antique Wax as stain. I like this stuff because it's water-based and it has no odor. It really gives the look of stain, although you could also just use watered down acrylic paint. I'm applying the wax and wiping away the excess before it has time to dry on the surface. To assemble the back, I used a tiny amount of glue in each of the holes. I like to apply the glue with a tiny precision tip bottle, but you can also use a little pile of glue and a toothpick to apply it. White glue or wood glue will work well for this. I was pretty careful with my glue application, but there's still some glue on the surface. I decided to stain the pieces prior to assembly for this very reason. Anywhere glue squeezes out would have resisted the stain, so there would have been pale spots. I'm using a needle to remove the excess glue. I'm assembling the chair by attaching the seat and the back rails and then capping off the other side. The instructions from the kit suggest allowing the glue to dry before moving on, but I assembled the entire chair at once. It did fall apart a couple of times, but if you're persistent, the little bugger will stay together. Once it was assembled, I added an extra bead of glue on the top and bottom of the seat to make it more secure. The upholstery will cover this later. You could leave it just like this, but I will be adding the upholstered seat. To attach my little piece of foam to the cardboard, I'm using a glue stick. Glue sticks seem to be relegated to elementary school, but I like to use them frequently, especially if I'm attaching something to a paper product. I'll be using this chair in a really rustic old space, so I added some lumpy hot glue to the surface to try to make the seat look less perfect. I used a poorly executed gift wrapping technique to upholster the chair. To reduce bulk, I cut away the corner piece. So the pieces hold immediately, I used hot glue. I started by wrapping each of the sides of the chair seat. When it came to wrapping the front, I folded the front over, but I got hot glue all over my seat. If I was more patient, I could have used a fabric glue or Fabri-Tac to prevent this issue. To cover up the hot glue edge, I hastily made a piece of trim by folding a skinnier piece of fabric. First, I folded it at the top and then at the bottom, so I'll have two finished edges. I was planning to use this piece to disguise the hot glue I got all over the seat, but then I got hot glue all over this piece as well. But since the castle is an old space, I'm telling myself this is fine and it's just wear from the students over the years. I really like the light tone of the wood, but the Gryffindor Common Room has much darker furniture, so I'm mixing up more of a mahogany stain. It's handy to know I can change the color of the antique Waverly wax by adding acrylic paint, so I can create a variety of different shades of stain. I tested the color on the bottom before committing. For the second chair, I sanded all of the pieces and assembled it according to the instructions. I tried to use the layout sheet to get the proper placement of the back rails, but it didn't work very well. The paper wasn't flat enough, so the back pieces kept popping off, so I just eyeballed it and assembled them on my desk. For this chair, I took my chances and assembled the chair prior to staining the pieces. I cleaned away the excess glue, but there were still pale spots where the stain was resisted. Fortunately, this is going in a rustic space, so I mixed up some watered down black and brown paint to cover these pale areas. I'm sealing the chairs and adding a bit of shine using wax. Don't go running out and buying this product because I'm just using it from a leftover Pinterest project from 2015. You could seal your chairs with polyurethane or even Mod Podge. I applied the wax, let it dry for 15 minutes, and buffed away the excess. I used a different technique for the second upholstered seat and it worked a lot better. I started by gluing the foam to the cardboard surface just like the first chair. I'm upholstering this seat with this fabric I got from Bentley House Minis, but I'm using the back to avoid the color on the front. This time I started by attaching the fabric to the back of the chair. Instead of cutting away the excess fabric at the corners, I folded over the fabric like this. This made the seat a little bit thicker, but it still works well. I left overhang on the front so I can fold all of this fabric over the front of the chair. I think this looks more sophisticated and it's a lot easier. I glued it to the underside with hot glue. I'm using the ugly hot glue cushion on the simpler chair. During my collaboration with Bentley House Minis, she not only made me 2 chairs for the Gryffindor Common Room, but she sent me extra bits, fabric, and this little stool. I used my new heat gun to remove the top of the stool so I can reupholster it. I softened the glue using my heat gun, but this was actually a risky venture because there was plastic-based foam underneath that I could have melted. I always keep my heat gun moving, so fortunately I didn't ruin the foam. I'm adding some tufting to this piece and I'm starting by making a pattern. To avoid measuring or doing any math, I cut a piece of paper the same size as the seat I'm upholstering. I folded the piece of paper in half lengthwise and in thirds. I attached the piece of paper with a glue stick because I will be removing this and glue sticks make it really easy to pull off later. I'm marking where the folds intersect so I know where to drill the holes for my tufting. I started the holes with my small drill bit. I don't want the paper to become too attached, so I'm separating them now before they spend too much time together. These holes are too tiny for my needle to pass through, so I made them bigger with a larger bit. To execute the tufting, I laid the piece of fabric over the top and put the needle through the back through the hole. I'm securing the thread on the back using some hot glue so it doesn't pull all the way through. I brought the needle up through the hole, placed the bead, and pulled it tight. The fabric is firmly attached in the middle since there are 2 beads going through it, so I secured the edges with some more hot glue. The top looks great, but the bottom is a hot mess, so I cut a small rectangle and glued it to the bottom to hide all of that. This is the same velvet fabric Ava from Bentley House Minis used to make one of my chairs. She aged the fabric by coating it, so I'm making up my own mixture using some watered down glue and brown paint. Before reattaching this piece, I sanded the stool to remove some of the shine. I'm just lightly scuffing the surface to add texture rather than trying to remove the color. I recoated the stool with some matte Mod Podge. I inadvertently softened the wood glue on the side of the stool earlier when I was using my heat gun to remove the seat. So now I need to reassemble the stool, including the side piece. I'm using hot glue to attach the top portion and wood glue on the bottom piece. The hot glue holds the upholstered piece immediately, and the wood glue will hold it all together over time.
Making furniture from scratch can be a huge undertaking, so I hope you customize some kits to get a look you like without as much work or thought and planning.
I've come up with an innovative way to add color to the frames of this spring-themed art kit from Robin Betterly. For some of the frames, I'm adding color with a marker to simulate wood stain. These two oval pieces make up one stacked frame, so I'm painting both of the pieces gold. Before I began painting, I paid attention to which art piece correlates with each frame so I can make a plan for coloring and understand which frames end up stacked in 2 layers. I colored these 2 pieces separately so the glue wouldn't repel any stain or marker I used. Layering the 2 pieces creates a lot of dimension and makes this look more like carved wood. For the rest of the pieces, I assembled them and then attached them to a popsicle stick to prepare for paint. I painted each of the frames white, painting from multiple directions to make sure I didn't miss any of the wood. I had a limited range of colors and didn't feel like mixing paint, so I decided to try layering chalk pastels over the white paint. The color catches in the painted surface and provides a nice light color with an uneven and chalky appearance. This technique lends itself well to a rustic, worn, or shabby chic look. The pieces of art vary in size, so they each coordinate with a specific frame. I matched each of the frames with the art before I decided on colors. To create the look of glass and protect the paper prints, I added a coat of dimensional magic, but you can also use Diamond Glaze. I avoid using Mod Podge to mimic glass since it dries with visible brush strokes that catch the light. A layer of tape or trash plastic works as well. I really love the wide range of pastel colors I got by layering chalk pastels over white paint. For more realism, I added easy custom details to a miniature flower kit from Earth and Tree. The kit includes laser cut paper for the flowers and leaves and paper coated wire for the stems. I'm starting with the center of the flower. These snowflake looking pieces are the stamen of the flower. The kit instructs to paint the ends black, so I'm softening the transition by adding some brown chalk pastels. It's really hard to see, but there is a tiny laser cut hole in the center of each of these so they can slide onto the wire. To finish the stamens, I need to attach them to the wire, so I'm cutting 12 pieces about 1 3/4 inches. I measured one of the pieces, then eyeballed the rest for variation and to avoid measuring. I'm saving this extra paper-coated wire to make more flowers in the future. Starting with a nice clean cut, I'm adding a bit of white glue and placing the stamen hole over the wire. I like the bit of realism the circular ends add, but for a little bit more detail, I'm adding a small dab of glue on the front and back of each of the circles. This dried really quickly with a domed appearance for dimension. I'm easily shaping the stamen by pushing the pieces up and then rolling them in between my fingers. I'm painting the circular ends with black acrylic paint. Most of the pastels were rubbed off while I was rolling these, so you can probably skip that step. This particular tulip kit comes with a few different options for paper colors, including shades of red and yellow. I chose the kit for making white tulips so I can add my own color and get a variety of different looking flowers from one kit. I'm using watercolor to add the color and using 2 different colors for each flower. While the base color is still wet, I'm adding a darker color in the center and dragging the paint out toward the edges. The watercolors blend nicely and look natural. You could also try watered down acrylic paint, colored pencils, or markers. If you're not sure about a color, you can try it in some of the scrap areas of the paper to see how it'll look before you commit to adding it to one of the laser cut flowers. Before adding the secondary color, I folded each of the flowers onto a blade and painted the back while I still had the base color on my brush. Some of the paint was a custom mix, so I did it this way to make sure the front of the flowers matched the back. I sped up the dry time using a hairdryer and sealed the flowers using Mod Podge. I used matte Mod Podge, but I would probably use gloss next time for a bit of added sheen. The front dried really quickly, then I sealed the back. I'm mimicking the veins you see on flowers using a very thin black marker. Starting in the center, I'm making some lines radiating outward. I flipped the paper over and added the same black lines and some white gel pen lines. I shaped my flowers so the white lines are on the inside. To shape the flower, I'm using some foam and a ball stylus from the Dollar Tree. I'm rolling the large end of the ball stylus in a small circle on each petal. This naturally causes the paper to curl in toward itself and tighten up. If you don't have foam, you could use the palm of your hand, a computer mouse pad, or a few layers of paper towel. If you don't have a ball stylus, it's much harder to find a suitable substitute, although I have used the rounded end of a sewing pin. Ball styluses are really cheap and super handy if you're making miniature crafts, so they're worth the investment. The edges of the petals have very subtle scalloping, which adds to the realism. To assemble, I slid the shaped flower onto the wire and added a bit of glue below the stamen. Each of the flowers has a tiny laser cut hole in the center to make assembly easy. If you're having a hard time getting your flowers onto the wire, make a new, cleaner cut. This kit is designed so the stamens are taller than the edges of the petals, which is a very pretty look. These are already looking so good, but we still need to add the leaves. The green paper is a pretty dark sage green that matches the stems, but tulips have a much richer green color. Leaves naturally have some variation, so I'm starting by using a Sharpie to color the edges of the leaves. I'm taming the crazy contrast between the two colors using some acrylic paint. I added the paint full strength and didn't water it down. I'm using the same paint to color each stem so the stems will match the leaves. I'm adding a bit of paint at the very bottom of the flower to mimic those tiny leaves you see where the stem meets the flower. All of the laser cut leaves are the same size and shape, which isn't very realistic. I'm cutting a small sliver off the right side of each leaf for variation. Now some of the leaves are a bit skinnier than others and the sides aren't perfectly symmetrical. To shape the leaf, you can use the large end of the ball stylus on the edge of each leaf and run it up the center. Then you can gently fold the center, making sure not to press a hard line. You can shape your leaves that way if you'd like, but I was much too impatient to do that to each leaf. Instead, I dampened the leaves with watered down glue so they'll hold the shape when they dry, and press them all over the foam with the ball stylus. The dried leaves have a rich green color and are slightly crinkly. Each of the leaves have a tiny tab at the very bottom so you can attach them to the stem. I'm attaching my leaves with white glue toward the top so the leaves will still be visible if the flowers are displayed in a vase. Once the flowers were assembled, I gave them a quick messy coat of gloss Mod Podge. Since Mod Podge is an adhesive, it not only adds some shine, but there's the added benefit of helping the leaves stick to the stem. Whether you're making minis by hand or customizing a kit, make sure you add the little details that make all the difference.
I got this Gryffindor coal scuttle kit that came with some black gravel and a tiny shovel. I got this kit from Earth and Tree Miniatures, but at some point I lost the plastic handle for the bucket. I'm using a simple painting process to make this plastic bucket look like metal. Since the bucket is already black, I don't need to add a base coat, so I'm just adding a coat of my cheap acrylic silver paint. To start the aging process, I'm dabbing on some black paint with a Torn Sea sponge I got at the Dollar Tree. I'm trying to concentrate the corrosion around the rim and around the base where the metal meets one another. The key to make this technique look realistic is finishing with the same base color, so right now I'm going over the black with more silver. The silver top coat helps reduce a lot of the black so it looks less like something that was sponge painted and more like really tiny specks of corrosion. You could use the same painting technique on paper to make it look like metal as well. Since I can't help myself, I'm adding a little bit of rust effects. At first I wasn't planning to because I didn't think a coal bucket would get rusty, but now I'm thinking they have to rinse this bucket and that's how the rust formed. The kit comes with enough black gravel to fill most of the bucket, but I want to save some for future projects, so I'm filling most of the space with aluminum foil. To add a little bit of height to the pile, I'm adding a layer of hot glue. I'm painting the hot glue black, so if anything shows through the little pieces of coal, you won't see any silver or hot glue. If you want to make your own bucket of coal but you don't have any foam coal pieces, you can glue down some pebbles from outside and paint those black.
I want the shovel to be sticking out of the coal, so I'm pressing it into the hot glue where it removed a little bit of paint, and now I'm going to use my knife to make a spot for the shovel. I'm using rubber finger protectors from the Dollar Tree. It's too difficult to slice the hot glue in aluminum foil, so I'm just sticking the tip of the knife in and wiggling it back and forth. I want the shovel to look like it's half buried in the coals, so I'm using my pliers to trim off some of the shovel so it's easier to add to the bucket. I used a little bit of white glue to glue it in place. To give the coal something to stick to, I mixed some black paint with white Elmer's glue and painted it over the entire surface. Some of the coal isn't in contact with the glue, so for added insurance, I'm adding some watered down glue to hold everything in place. The glue has a tendency to want to just sit on the surface. A good trick is spraying it with rubbing alcohol to allow the glue to just flow right into the cracks, but on small projects like this, I just force it in with a paintbrush. As a finishing touch, I'm sprinkling on a little bit of white chalk pastels before it dries. I'm not sure if an antique stove like this would use wood or coal, but either way, I think the bucket works. Once I glue it in place, I'll add a little pile of ash in front of it. The entire room box is centered around this plastic Gryffindor stove. I previously sanded it to give it a matte finish, and now I'm using some enamel paint to paint all of the details silver. I'm using Tester's enamel paint, which is oil-based. I'll leave a link in the description where you can find this kit. I mostly used the side of the bristles to paint all of the relief details. I'll be covering the stovetop with some food and accessories, but first I'm adding a finishing touch to the egg carton stone hearth. I customized this plastic coal scuttle from Gryffindor in the last video, and now I'm adding a little bit more detail. I used to have a wood stove where I previously lived, and there was always a little bit of ash and coal around the bucket. I mixed some black and white chalk pastels and used some of the foam coal included in the kit. I'm painting this hot water bottle from a Gryffindor kit so it looks more like the brass inspiration photo. I started with a base of yellow paint to make the metallic layers stand out. I made it look really old by rubbing on some brown paint and wiping most of it off. I'll be assembling this pump organ kit I got from Earth and Tree Miniatures, which is made by Gryffindor. I really love these Gryffindor kits because they're perfectly to scale and often have beautiful detail. This kit includes lots of pieces and the instructions are pretty boring, so instead of telling you step by step how to assemble it, I'll be focusing on the finishing techniques I use. All of these plastic pieces were made in a mold, so I'm starting by cleaning all of the pieces with rubbing alcohol to remove any grease, oil, or mold release. This particular type of plastic is really easy to paint with regular cheap acrylic paints. I'd like to go for a mahogany looking wood tone, so I'm mixing red, orange, and brown acrylic paint. All of these plastic pieces have really fine wood grain detail on the surface. To achieve a better finish, I'm brushing the paint on in the direction of the faux wood grain pieces. The instructions advise removing all of the pieces from the sprue and cleaning up the edges, but I'm painting most of the pieces in place. For any pieces I do remove from the sprue, I'm using a utility knife to remove the little burrs. And then you can finish smoothing it out either with an emery board or a little piece of sandpaper. I've probably spent hours of my life crawling around in my office looking for fallen miniatures, so I'm keeping tiny pieces like this attached to the sprue until I'm ready to assemble them. After one thin coat of paint, you can still see the yellowish undertones from the plastic, which makes it look more dimensional and realistic. This piece on the left has 2 coats of paint, but I think it's too opaque, so I'm sticking with 1 coat. This single splotchy layer of paint looks a bit unfinished, so I'm watering down some antique wax from Waverly and adding a bit of red to create a wash over top. This wash was applying more like a paint, so I added some more water. I recently discovered you can add acrylic paint to your antique wax from Waverly to change the tint and tone, so I'm really enjoying playing around with this technique. The instructions state to use some kind of cement that's meant for bonding plastic and polystyrene pieces, but I used super glue throughout and it worked just fine. I'm attaching this side piece and using the front piece to keep it stable and make sure it's at a 90-degree angle so it doesn't dry in the wrong spot. I'm holding the front piece in place while the super glue bonds. I won't be showing you piece by piece how I assembled this, but just follow the instructions. I assembled the top portion and the bottom separately. These little pieces get attached without being glued in. I'll be using this piano in an aged Halloween-themed project, so I'm aging the keyboard with some antique wax from Waverly. I'm getting creative when it comes to aging the black piece of the keyboard. I've seen Bentley House Minis age black with some white washes, so I'm following her approach and using white wax from Waverly. I sanded the plastic to add a bit of tooth, and now I'm brushing on a small amount of the wax just to subdue the black and make it so it doesn't look brand new. The kit comes with these adorable knobs, so I'm painting them white to make them look like porcelain. I've seen some antique knobs that have this sort of look, so I'm emulating it. I meant to just paint the tips of all of the knobs white, but I'm a sloppy painter and they ended up completely white, and that's fine. To age these knobs and subdue the white, I'm adding a wash of antique wax by Waverly. I made this wash by watering down some of the wax. This type of porcelain knob has a hole in the center and is attached by a nail, so I'm simulating the look of a nail by adding a dot of black paint using my Dollar Tree ball stylus. I mostly followed the instructions, but above this row of knobs, there's supposed to be a drawer that comes out and covers the key underneath this little piece. I'm skipping adding that piece and instead will assemble the piano without it. When you exclude the piano key cover, it leaves an awkward gap. I cut a rectangle of cereal box and colored the edges with a black Sharpie, and I'm gluing the row of knobs to this piece of paper to fill that gap. I'm carrying on with the painting by adding some black acrylic paint to Waverly wax. Miniatures are often too small to cast their own shadows, so I'm using this darker shade to create some forced perspective. I'm adding this dark color anywhere a shadow would be cast, like underneath the shelves and on the underside of these little bars. I'm using a very dry brush and scrubbing some more of this darker color into the corners. You can see how the shadows I added to the underside add some weight to this piece. I carried on aging the bottom half of the piano as well. I haven't aged to this side of the piano, so you can see how it contrasts with the side I added the black to. The stool hasn't been getting any attention, but I've been working on that as well. I haven't glued the top on because I haven't decided whether I want to upholster the top or leave it faux wood. Let me know what you think I should do. This final detail was an afterthought, but it adds so much to the piece, I'm really glad I did it. I'm using some antique gold rub and buff to emphasize the tiny details on this piano. I'm using a fine brush to apply the antique gold and really trying not to get it on areas I don't want it because it is hard to remove. I'm certainly not using my favorite brush, and I used rubbing alcohol to clean the brush afterward. I went outside of the lines and got some gold on the piano, so I'm trying to cover that up with some black, and I went over top of it with some black shaved chalk pastel to cover it even more. I added some gold to the nice chunky carving detail on the bottom of the piano as well as many of the fine details. The very bottom of the piano has a smooth edge that doesn't have any faux wood detail, so it was harder to paint with the acrylic paint. These areas were pretty thin and sparse, so I covered the entire bottom rim with some of the gold and it looks beautiful. There are indented areas that look like carved wood that I'm emphasizing with some very watered down gold acrylic paint. I'm using a really fine brush to drop it into the indent so it's flush with the surface and letting that dry. I sealed the whole piece with matte Mod Podge. Robin Betterly kindly gifted me this Christmas-themed secret book kit. Once completed, there will be a miniature scene hidden inside of a 1/12 scale book. I won't be going step by step since the instructions are really clear. Instead, I'll quickly assemble and focus on my custom touches. Also, this is the tiniest laser cutting I've ever seen. I'm starting by not following the instructions and popping the laser cut pieces out rather than cutting the tiny tab with a knife. I'm sanding off this little tab using one stroke against fine sandpaper. Removing those tabs will ensure the pieces fit together nicely. It's thin wood, so one pass on the sandpaper does the trick. Using my precision tip glue bottle, I'm attaching the book center to one of the bookends using canopy glue. Canopy glue is a nice sticky white glue. I think of it as thin tacky glue. I attached the bookends and the book center to a cardstock book cover. There are tabs, so it makes it really easy to line this up. If you've ever watched Julie Warren, you see that she tidies up her excess glue using a toothpick, so I'm doing that here now. If I were staining these pieces, I would do it prior to gluing so the glue doesn't block any of the stain. I'm attaching the final book cover by adding glue to all of the flat surfaces and making sure the rounded edge is toward the back. It may be hard to tell on camera, but there are rounded corners to the book cover. The flat squared off edges are toward the opening and the rounded ones are toward the three sides, which will eventually be the book pages. The secret room will slide into the opening. These two pieces help make up the walls of the secret room. I added some glue and plopped these into place and was really impressed with myself for getting this on one try, but the tabs are facing up, so I had to remove that and install it properly. You can see these tiny laser cut tabs which fit together very nicely to make a perfectly fitting frame. I have a ceiling, a floor, and one wall, so I'm closing this off to finish the room. The secret room will contain a market stall with a little roof. It'll feature tiny laser cut pieces and some simple custom touches from me. Most of the book cover will be covered with paper, but I will see the ends, so I'm sanding off some of the char from the laser cut process. I have found that sanding or cleaning this with rubbing alcohol makes it easier to cover with light paint. I'll ultimately be painting the book cover green, but I want it to show up nicely, so I'm giving it a base coat of white paint. This tiny bit of overhang will be showing, so I painted that white as well. This is the book spine. There's a laser cut rectangle to show you where to attach it to the small box we just assembled, which is the secret room. This will be visible around the secret room, so I painted that with a base coat of white as well. The secret room attaches right here, and it's easy to align it because of the laser cut rectangle. I thought I'd have to mix some paint to match the graphic, but this really cheap paint from Artist Loft, Sap Green, is a perfect match. To make all these sections green, I'm going over all of the places I painted white. Anything I'm not painting will be covered by a graphic. This took a couple of coats since the paint is really cheap and I'm impatient and kept trying to apply additional coats while the first coat wasn't completely dry. I could have sped up the drying with a hairdryer. I painted the entire exterior of the secret room, including the back, and then glued the spine into place. I cut out the 3 pieces that cover the inside wall of the secret room. I don't want there to be any pale wood showing in between the pieces of paper, so I'm using a brown marker to color in the corners. I used the same brown marker on the top and painted the floor green. I like to use a glue stick to apply pieces of paper so it doesn't ripple and add excess moisture. I'm using a dry paintbrush to push it into place. I attached the side walls the same way. The instructions emphasize not gluing the spine to the wrong side of the box, which is exactly what I did, so I popped it off and glued it to the left side. I cut out the 3 pieces that cover the spine and the front and back of the book. I used a glue stick and my precision tip glue bottle to glue down any loose corners. I covered the front and the back, making sure the graphics were upright, and then attached the secret room to make sure the spine was in a good position. The 3 edges get covered with this graphic that looks like the printed edges of book pages. I glued on the 2 short pieces first, making sure to overlap the corners so there won't be any book visible after I attach the final piece of paper. The 2 short pieces are printed a bit too long, so you can wrap the overhang. This final piece is printed exactly to size to cover this side of the book. Moving to the inside, I used a brown marker to color the awning and another brown marker to color the counter. This brown Sharpie ended up being a lot darker than I was hoping for the countertop, so make sure you test any of your colors on the scrap pieces before committing. The instructions suggest possibly adding some fake snow to the roof of the market stall. I'm going a little bit beyond that by using these scalloped scissors to add some fake shingles to my roof. I'm creating rows of shingles by using the pinking shears and then my straight scissors to cut strips. Maybe pinking shears are just the triangular scissors, I don't know if that's the right term. I'm cutting the shingles out of chipboard, which is what cereal boxes are made of. It's a very tiny roof, so I only need a couple of strips of shingles. This is really thin wood and I don't want to warp it, so I'm using some double-sided Scotch tape to attach the shingles. I'm starting the first row of shingles at the bottom, overhanging the edge. To keep it firmly attached, I'm pressing it into place and adding a row of glue to stagger the second row of shingles. Since additional rows won't be in contact entirely with the tape, I added glue for each subsequent row. Cutting the excess off the sides was really easy, but it's a little bit trickier to cut the scallop off the bottom because you have to cut in between each of the little circles. It wasn't hard by any means, but maybe I could have cut this excess off beforehand. I'm adding color to the shingles with some black paint and wiping away the excess while it's still wet using my finger. This creates a really natural gradation that kind of looks like slate. I'm adding some snow to my roof, but I don't want to completely obscure my shingles, so I'm carefully adding glue to the very edges of the scallops. I'm using fine sand as my snow. I'm storing my sand in a repurposed spice container. I'm using a rubber sculpting tool to reposition the sand while the glue is still wet. Since the tip is made of silicone, the glue doesn't stick to it easily, so it works well for this purpose. I'm not wasting a bit of paint and making cleanup really easy by applying some rub and buff to the market stall using the same rubber tool. I'm gluing my countertop to the inside of the stall with the gold facing outward. I glued it inside the secret room by applying glue on the left, right, and the bottom. The top is open to accommodate the roof. I sanded the roof at an angle and cut some off the top so it would fit. Since my roof had overhanging shingles, it was deeper than the original roof, so the box wouldn't close over it. It was really easy to give it a little trim. These tiny pieces adorn the inside of the market stall. This wood is as thin as a piece of paper. I added gold with the rubber tool and glued them to the countertop. The stall is antique gold and the decorations are gold leaf from Rub and Buff. I always hold on to my laser cut scraps for making miniatures from scratch. I'm adding some festive charm to the inside of the secret room using some forest moss. Rather than attaching it in large pieces, I'm pulling off the tiny little ends so it's more in scale and easier to control the shape. I eventually realized it's easier to drag your finger along the little pieces of forest moss to separate these pieces rather than using tweezers. I applied some white glue in the shape of a swag and started adding the tiny pieces. The tweezers made the process really tedious, so instead I used a slightly damp toothpick to pick up the pieces. To make the toothpick slightly tacky, I stuck it in some glue and wiped all of the excess off so I could easily pick up my moss pieces. One thin row of moss wasn't substantial enough, so I added a bit more, making sure the secret room can still close inside of the cover without disturbing any of the moss. I'm adding some teeny tiny beads to my miniature garland to make it look like Christmas ornaments. These are metal caviar beads intended for gluing onto your fingernails, and I'm using the smallest size. I got these from Temu. This could easily become a maddening, far too tedious process, so here's the simple method I came up with. I added a small bit of glue in a convenient place, which in this case is my index finger. I am dipping the toothpick into the glue and applying it to the place on the garland I'll be adding the metal ball. The toothpick tip is tacky enough to pick up a bead, but not so tacky that it won't come off. If you're holding this closer to your face, it's really easy to only pick up one bead at a time, but since I was demonstrating this about a foot away from my face, I was picking up multiple beads, so it's actually even easier than I'm showing here. I carried on applying the beads, making sure to press them into the moss because I don't want any of them popping off of the garland when I slide the secret room into the book. I'm adding red caviar beads to look like more baubles or tiny berries. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month. Watch this video next to see my favorite project I've ever made, where I added so many custom details to a cottage kit.